Hello, welcome to Friday Film. This week we're discussing climate change with Amy, who's over there. And we've known Amy for a long time and vice versa. So do you want to introduce yourself, Amy, and say who you are and why you?
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Neil. So yeah, I'm Amy. I've been part of the. Oh, wrong way, sorry. Thanks, Neil. Oh yeah, thanks, Neil. So yeah, I've been part of the church for a very long time. Some of you may have seen me. But yeah, about 5 years ago, I moved to London to start work, and I work in financial services. I work for a bank, and I remember at the time I got my first like placement through of what I was going to be doing, and it was talking about climate change, climate risk, climate regulations, and I thought, what has a bank got to do with that sort of thing? But as soon as I started in my role, I found it really interesting to see what I could do and what the bank as a whole were doing in relation to sort of climate change. It becomes sort of a real topic, and I felt really connected to the role. So as I've progressed through my career and within the bank, I've sort of decided to sort of specialize in climate change, sustainability a bit more broadly. Some people might know it as CSR, which is sort of corporate social responsibility, which is a little bit outdated now. The phrase people tend to use is ESG, which means environment, social and governance, and those are the topics that I'm increasingly looking at as part of my role in the bank. So yeah, I focused on climate for a number of years. I'm starting to look at sort of social risks as well now, so like diversity and inclusion, those sorts of things, and even stuff like nature is starting to become on the topics at the bank. So it's constantly evolving, but yeah, the main part of the work has been on climate for a few years.
So this is a big bank then, and this is really how their your job is to make sure that they kind of have a conscience, I suppose. Would that be a fair description?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different roles across the bank that work on sustainability. So there's some roles where in the commercial sector we're working directly with clients, so directly with clients that we lend money to support them with their sustainability efforts, their sustainability strategies. We have people who work on products and propositions that can support the transition to what we call net zero, which I'll talk about a bit later. So we offer things like green living rewards, so sort of cash back if you're purchasing a property of a certain sort of sustainability level. And I work in what's called internal audit, which is, yeah, it's sort of like the checkers of the bank. So having a look at all of those different processes, how we're creating products, how we're responding to regulation, how we're setting targets for sustainability, how we're tracking against those targets, and trying to check that everything is sort of above board. We're not taking on any unnecessary risks. We're controlling any risks where we can, and what we're doing our best to sort of meet either our targets or the things that we sort of claim externally to the public.
Sorry, I had to walk around a bit then. What's interesting about that is because you could take one could take a quite a cynical view about the big corporates, in terms of whether it's just greenwashing, which we're not here to discuss really, and issues like that. But I think what some of the companies are discovering is that actually it's good for business. And if that makes companies behave more ethically and more environmentally friendly, well, it doesn't matter what the reason is. If it's good for business and it's good for the planet, that's a win for everyone, isn't it, really? So I think that's what I think the fact that the bigger companies have people like you in place shows that they do see there is some role to be had for it. So it's good that you're there as well. We know you, so we're excited that you've got this job because it's in the big city as well, isn't it, and everything.
Yeah, it's all cool and jazzy and that sort of stuff. And it's really good, like I said, to be, feeling like the role that I'm doing is quite fulfilling. It's quite relevant. Sort of there's got a purpose to it, which I feel really strongly about and have sort of developed over sort of my career into sort of focusing in that area and supporting others in developing in the area. So something a big part of my role as well is training and upskilling other colleagues on what this is, how that might impact them, how it might influence their role. So I think it is a real big space for change and development, and it is exciting to be a part of.
Yeah, it's good. So, well, shall we start with some questions then? So one of them is then, what is the impact of the changes that we're seeing in the environment around us? What difference does it make? I know there's all sorts of conversations that can be had over the causes of it, and to what extent is the human involvement, and to what extent is it the natural cycle of the planet. Though that aside, what's the impact that we're seeing at the moment with the changes we're seeing in the climate?
I think there's sort of two lenses on the impact. I think the one level, which is the impact that we see day to day, or not necessarily day by day, but over sort of the shorter term, is we're seeing sort of increase in average temperatures. So, we're having sort of really intense periods of heat. We're having really intense periods of cold weather. And although it might not seem like a lot, we have, 1 week where it's really hot, or another week where it's really cold, or we're getting times where it's really hot in a month where you might not expect it to be really hot, and vice versa. It's like those sorts of what seem like minor sort of impacts, but actually those are only going to increase in frequency, and actually those minor impacts are actually a very big shift to what we're used to. So the impacts of that, so there's a lot of impacts from increasing temperatures. So there's impact on sort of health and well-being, impact on sort of productivity within work, impact on our sort of agriculture systems. So to us it might seem like, oh, it's great, we're getting a really hot couple of weeks of summer, but those sorts of intense periods of heat isn't necessarily very good in the production of some sort of crops and food, and actually that can change how they harvest and the seasons, and that has the knock-on effects there.
I think that's one of
Similar,
thinking for us urban people, isn't it? That we don't really, we're not that attached to the earth in terms of things growing. So we, like you say, we just think it's nice weather, but the unpredictable weather and the frequency of more extreme weather, if there's a major crisis in areas where they grow crops, we may not feel it for 12 months, but it does make a difference, doesn't it?
exactly, yeah, it's all around those sorts of life cycle processes, and the other thing is the changes we've seen in sort of rainfall as well. So again, what we're finding is we're getting more intense periods of rain over sort of shorter periods, and again that can have impact on infrastructure. We see the impacts that has on travel systems and sometimes transport. So potentially, train services suddenly become delayed, cancels impacted by that.
Right.
Again, has an impact on sort of crops and production, or can even have an impact closer to home in terms of how frequent sort of floods are now. And depending on where you are and how much that affects you. Again, we're I guess where we are, we're not close to any big water reserves, so we're not sort of, maybe our houses aren't prone to flooding, but areas that are near lakes and rivers are constantly battling floods, and where they might have been once every few years or really an odd occurrence, they're starting to happen much more frequently now.
Yeah, we
And
heard on
then
Sunday about the effect it has on migration as the seas heat up, that the coastlines, they come in, yeah, they kind of advance, don't they? And that has an impact on people as well. So in terms of timescales, what, maybe we don't feel it so much in this particular part of the world where we're in. I mean, is there any idea how long it is before we'll start really impacting, like the UK, Great Britain, in terms of
yeah, I guess it's a bit of a difficult one, because it will really depend on our efforts towards reducing the impacts of climate change, which when we talk about sort of what's being done a little bit later on, it's sort of, yeah, how can we potentially reduce and limit the impacts of climate change? And depending on how well or how much we do that will depend on then the timelines of when the effects are felt. So yeah, you're correct, sort of different areas of the world, different parts of the globe will feel it at different points in time. So extreme weather events, we're quite fortunate in the UK to not experience those. So things like hurricanes, tsunamis, but you might have seen on the news, increasing these types of events in other parts of the world. So we're not necessarily subject to those sorts of really intense extreme events, at least not yet. I think one of the fundamental sort of pivots or focuses of the timelines of this. So back in 2015, there was the Paris Agreement, which basically says we need to try and keep the increase in global average temperature to below 2 degrees above what it was pre-industrial levels. So that's sort of the target we've got. And you might have seen a lot of targets mentioned either in the media, either by governments, either by companies around reaching net zero by 2050. So I think 2050, although seems far away, it's not that far away. And that's sort of, I think, one of the pivotal points, that if we don't focus on becoming net zero by 2050, we'll start to see the impacts. I think it's slightly less likely for potentially my generation to be seeing some of the impacts, but I think the generations after me is where, if we don't make the changes, we'll start to feel those impacts a little bit more. But like I said, we're seeing some of them now. You know, extreme weathers, increased rainfall, increased flooding. So, you know, we're sort of it's almost happening around us, but
Yes.
it's at the moment not too intense or not having more detrimental impacts on us.
It's like a lot of these subjects actually that we've been looking at over the month, they don't all affect all of us all the time. So it's easy not to worry about it. We'll be talking about racism. Um, is the next topic up. And for me, racism, it's not an issue
Yeah.
on a day-to-day basis. I mean, if you look at it in those strictly narrow terms, and climate change is the same, but actually one of the things that we talked about again on Sunday, that because our the younger half of the church kind of led the conversations, was about how we're all connected actually. And you can't, no one is an island, is it? I mean, it's a bit of a cliche now, but it's true. What affects one person, Martin Luther King said, an injustice for one is an injustice for everyone. It does impact. And things like migration and food and all that sort of stuff. We may think, well, our country's fine. Well, at the moment, but there's things we can do, which perhaps is that the time to what's being done? Are you aware of what's being done? Maybe through what your current work is or your job is, what's being done to, here's a big word, to mitigate uh,
Yes.
the situation.
Well, it was really interesting because I think there's two key avenues of response. One is, as you say, mitigation. So how we prevent increasing temperatures, how we look to reduce greenhouse gases. And the other thing is adaptation, and, accepting to an extent we will have to deal with some of the impacts. So there's two avenues. Obviously, mitigation in the long term will be better at reducing the impacts. If you can, you want to try and stop it happening. But in the absence of that, you start to do adaptation. So an example adaptation is like flood defences and building up sort of seawalls and that sort of thing. So it's sort of admitting that, some of it will still happen, but and I think it's a combination of mitigation and adaptation that will help us. And I think, yeah, it's a big part of my role to understand what is being done on this subject, both at quite a high level, so looking at different governmental responses, what we're doing as a country, what other countries are doing, and then the main focus is in what my industry and my business is doing. So I think from a government level, I think that's where a lot of the influence needs to come from. So, the UK have set a target to become net zero by 2050. A lot of other countries have followed suit as well. Some countries tend to be a bit more advanced, some are a bit more behind. So both at a government level, also at a business and financial level. So we see a lot of the European countries, so parts of Scandinavia tend to be quite advanced in their policies and what they're doing. The UK tend to be a bit in the middle, and then places like America tend to be a little bit behind in what they're doing. So I think that the tone does really come from the top and from government level. So you might have heard that the government have imposed a ban on the sale of new petrol and diesel cars from 2035. That was originally 2030. They've pushed it out a little bit. That's what will really start to drive behaviours. So, some car manufacturers might have already started to develop electric vehicles. Many have. But as that sort of actual ban comes in place, a lot of them will have to do it, rather than some of them doing it for the business opportunities or for, the creation of new products. I think that's the sort of the high level.
It's interesting how policy drives shifts, because just on today on the news was about packaging. It doesn't sound very interesting at all, but the government policy now is that the producers have to pay the cost of recycling their stuff. And they're saying this is going to cost us phenomenally. And it's partly because we're used to this kind of cheap society where we just chuck stuff away. and it is. I do understand how that's going to be difficult for businesses that aren't set up for it. But in the long run, if we don't change, it's things are going to get worse, aren't they? So it is about really shifting, not just the minor stuff, but actually shifting the way we work. So if you're producing loads of glass as part of your business, you need to pay the cost of clearing it all up as well, which is because like oil slicks, isn't it? I don't know if there's an oil spillage where the governments pick up the bill for the cleanup or the people that made the mess. So partly
Yeah.
it's being responsible. I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there because, as seems to happen quite regularly on these subjects, we start going on again. So we're going to leave it there at that question of corporate responsibility. And I think one of the things that's come out quite a lot, particularly in the conversations around the environmental stuff, is who's responsible for what. And one of the things that comes back again and again and is ancient human wisdom is that actually we are all connected. What I do affects my neighbour because we are all sisters and brothers. And you might think, well, that's just hippie nonsense. Perhaps it is. Who knows? But what I do in this country affects what happens in another country. This is why countries get involved in one another. And no country works on its own. It's the same with me. If I create trouble, it rarely stays just with me. Trouble spreads. But the good news is that's even more true with goodness and with hope. So we'll pick this subject up again next week, and this idea of corporate responsibility and how responsible I am. What part do I play? What part can I play in improving our environmental surroundings, caring for creation? See you next time.